Welcome back to ZenLight 8, your go-to place for diving deep into life's biggest questions. Today, we're stepping into the incredible journey of Leo Tolstoy, one of the greatest writers the world has ever seen. Picture this: fame from war and peace, a loving family, and wealth most could only dream of. He had it all. Until he didn't. At 50, everything changed. Tolstoy plunged into a dark spiral of despair, haunted by questions like, why am I here? What's the point if it all just ends? From wrestling with nihilism to standing on the edge of suicide, he searched for answers in philosophy, science, and, ultimately, faith. Did Tolstoy really crack the meaning of life? Join us on ZenLight 8 as we uncover this gripping story, a roller coaster from torment to peace, from doubt to discovery. Tolstoy's existential crisis, a descent into the void. 1. The pinnacle of success, yet a hollow core. Leo Tolstoy, a name that echoes through the halls of literary history, seemed to have it all by the time he hit his late 40s. Fame? Check. His masterpieces War and Peace and Anna Karenina were already cementing his legacy as one of the greatest writers of all time. Wealth? Absolutely, he owned a sprawling estate, a testament to his material success. A loving family? You bet. A devoted wife and a house full of children surrounded him with warmth. By any measure, Tolstoy was living the dream, a man who'd climbed the mountain of life and planted his flag at the top. But then, something shifted. Around the age of 50, the ground beneath him started to crack. Despite all he'd achieved, a dark cloud rolled in, an existential crisis that would shake him to his core. Why? Because even with everything the world could offer, Tolstoy began to feel an unshakable emptiness, a void that no amount of success could fill. 2. The questions that haunted him. What happens when you've got it all, but it's still not enough? For Tolstoy, this wasn't just a passing thought. It was a relentless storm of questions that battered his mind day and night. Why am I here? He'd ask himself. What's the purpose of my life if everything just ends in death? These weren't casual musings over a cup of tea. They were the kind of soul-crushing queries that kept him awake, staring into the abyss. He'd built a life most would envy, yet now it felt like a house of cards, ready to collapse under the weight of its own meaninglessness. The man who'd once written about the grand sweep of history and the intricacies of human emotion now found himself fixated on the simplest, yet most terrifying question. Why should I care about anything at all? It was as if the spotlight of his intellect, once aimed at the world, had turned inward, and what it illuminated wasn't pretty. 3. The onset of nihilism. As these questions piled up, Tolstoy didn't just wrestle with doubt. He plunged headfirst into nihilism, that bleak philosophy where nothing matters and everything's just a cosmic joke. At 50, a time when many settle into the comfort of their accomplishments, Tolstoy's world flipped upside down. The joy he'd once found in writing, in his family, in the pleasures of life, it all started to evaporate. He described this shift in his essay A Confession, where he laid bare the torment of his soul. My life had come to a standstill, he wrote, and I felt like I was losing my grip on everything I'd held dear. Sleep became his only refuge, a temporary escape from the barrage of thoughts that assaulted him. It wasn't just sadness. It was a profound, gut-wrenching sense that life itself might be pointless, a treadmill leading nowhere. For a man who'd once lived so fully, this was a brutal fall. 4. The weight of mortality. A big part of Tolstoy's crisis was his sudden, overwhelming awareness of death. It wasn't abstract anymore. It was personal, looming, inevitable. He'd look at his life and think, if not now, then tomorrow. If not tomorrow, then in 30 years. Does it even matter? This wasn't just about growing older. It was about realizing that every step forward was a step closer to the end. In Anna Karenina, you can see this creeping dread mirrored in Levin, a character who, like Tolstoy, gets caught in an endless loop of why questions. Why live? Why die? Why anything? For Tolstoy, death wasn't just the end of the story. It was the erasure of the story itself, leaving behind nothing but silence. That thought hit him like a freight train, stripping away the illusions of purpose he'd once clung to. 5. A man unmoored. Imagine being Tolstoy at this point. A literary giant, a husband, a father, yet feeling like a stranger in your own life. He'd spent decades building something beautiful, only to wake up one day and see it as a mirage. The things that used to light him up, the applause of readers, the laughter of his kids, now felt distant, like echoes from someone else's world. He wrote about how he had to trick himself into not ending it all, a chilling admission from a man who seemed so in control. It's almost like he became an emotional toddler, as he put it, constantly asking why with no one to give him an answer. The confidence that had defined him was gone, replaced by a raw, vulnerable uncertainty. This wasn't just a midlife crisis. It was a full-on unraveling of everything he thought he knew. 6. The search for something solid. But here's the thing about Tolstoy. Even in his darkest moments, he didn't just give up. That emptiness, that negativity, it didn't paralyze him completely. Instead, it lit a spark, a desperate need to find something real, something that could anchor him again. He couldn't shake the feeling that there had to be more to life than this void staring back at him. Sure, he contemplated suicide, he was honest about that. But he didn't take that path. Instead, he turned his relentless mind toward a new quest. A search for meaning, for peace, for anything that could pull him out of the pit. It was a messy, chaotic journey, one that would take him through philosophy, science, and eventually faith. But it started right here, in the ashes of his crisis. 7. A universal struggle. Tolstoy's story hits hard because it's not just his, it's ours, too. Who hasn't, at some point, looked around and wondered what it's all for? His crisis at 50 wasn't unique to him. It was a magnified version of the doubts that creep into every human heart. He had the fame and the fortune, sure, but strip that away, and you've got a man grappling with the same fears we all face. The fear of being insignificant, of disappearing into nothing. What makes Tolstoy stand out isn't that he fell into this hole. It's that he clawed his way out, leaving behind a map for the rest of us. His existential crisis wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something bigger, something that would redefine his life and echo through time. Tolstoy's early life and religious doubt, seeds of a lifelong struggle. 1. A childhood shadowed by loss. Leo Tolstoy didn't exactly get the warm, fuzzy start to life you might imagine for a literary genius. Born in 1828 into Russian aristocracy, he should have had it easy: wealth, privilege, a sprawling estate. But fate had other plans. By the time he was 9, both his parents were gone. His mother died when he was just 2, and his father followed 7 years later. Imagine that. A little boy, suddenly orphaned, left to rattle around a big house with only siblings and distant relatives for company. That kind of loss doesn't just sting, it carves a hole in you. For Tolstoy, it planted a seed of abandonment, a quiet ache that would grow into something much bigger. He wasn't just alone. He felt cast adrift, like the world had turned its back on him before he even had a chance to figure it out. 2. The church, a cold comfort. With his parents gone, you'd think young Tolstoy might have turned to the church for solace. It was Russia, after all, steeped in Orthodox Christianity. But instead of finding a lifeline, he found something that rubbed him the wrong way. The church, with its rituals and rigid doctrines, didn't feel like a refuge. It felt like a cage. He saw priests preaching about divine love and eternal salvation. But to him, it all rang hollow. Where was that love when his parents were taken? Why did this God everyone praised leave him to fend for himself? Tolstoy didn't buy the answers the church shoveled out. They seemed too neat, too convenient. In his own words, he later wrote that religious doctrine, accepted on trust and supported by external pressure, started to crumble under the weight of his lived experience. Even as a kid, he wasn't one to swallow dogma whole. 3. A mind wired for doubt. Tolstoy wasn't just a grieving orphan. He was a thinker, even back then. He had this restless, probing mind that wouldn't let him settle for easy answers. Losing his parents didn't just make him sad. It made him skeptical. If life could snatch away the people he loved most, what was the point of all these grand promises about heaven and purpose? He started to see a disconnect between what the church taught and what he felt in his bones. Knowledge, the kind you get from books, from observing the world, began to clash with the fairy tales of faith he'd been fed. By his teens, he was already drifting away from Christianity, not because he wanted to rebel, but because it just didn't add up. The seeds of doubt were sprouting, and they'd only grow thornier as the years rolled on. 4. The weight of disillusionment. That early skepticism wasn't some passing phase that stuck with him, shaping how he saw the world. Tolstoy didn't just lose faith in God. He lost faith in the systems that propped God up. The church, with its gold icons and somber chants, started to look like a machine, one designed to control, not to comfort. He felt abandoned not just by his parents, but by the very institution that was supposed to step in when life got tough. In a confession, he'd later reflect on how this disillusionment set the stage for his bigger struggles. So that now, as formerly, he wrote, religious doctrine gradually throws away under the influence of knowledge and experience of life which conflicts with it. For Tolstoy, the church wasn't a beacon of truth. It was a shadow that obscured it. 5. A life built on questions. Here's the thing about Tolstoy's early years. They didn't just break him, they built him. Losing his parents and rejecting the church didn't leave him empty. They left him hungry. Hungry for answers, for something real to hold on to. He threw himself into education, into literature, into living life with a kind of reckless energy. In his 20s and 30s, he was a wild card gambling, drinking, chasing women, like he was trying to outrun the void his childhood had left behind. But even as he lived loud and free, those early doubts lingered. Why did he feel so alone, even in a crowd? Why did the church's promises of peace sound like noise to him? These questions didn't go away. They simmered, waiting for the right moment to boil over. 6. The clash of faith and reality. By the time Tolstoy hit his prime, that skepticism had hardened into a worldview. He wasn't just doubting the church. He was doubting the whole idea of faith as it was handed to him. Life, as he saw it, wasn't some neat little story with a happy ending tacked on. It was messy, brutal, unpredictable. And the more he learned, the more he lived, the less religion seemed to explain it. He read, he traveled, he fought in the Crimean War, and everywhere he went, he saw suffering, chaos, and beauty that didn't fit into the church's tidy box. Knowledge and experience became his gospel, and they told him a different story. That maybe the truth wasn't in sermons, but in the raw, unfiltered pulse of life itself. 7. The foundation of a crisis. Looking back, it's clear that Tolstoy's early life wasn't just a chapter. It was the prologue to everything that came later. Those losses, that disillusionment with religion, they didn't just shape his youth. They set the stage for the existential crisis that would hit him at 50. For decades, he'd pushed those doubts aside, building a life of success and family. But they never really left. They were there, lurking, ready to pounce when he least expected it. That little boy who felt abandoned by the world grew into a man who'd question everything: God, purpose, existence itself. His skepticism about the church wasn't the end of his journey. It was the spark that would eventually light a fire, driving him to seek a meaning bigger than the one he'd been offered. Nihilism and the brink of despair. Tolstoy's darkest hour. 1. The abyss opens up. By the time Leo Tolstoy hit 50, the life he'd built, fame, family, fortune, started to feel like a cruel mirage. He'd scaled the heights of human achievement, but instead of basking in the glow, he found himself staring into a void. That void had a name: nihilism. It wasn't just a passing gloom. It was a full-on obsession, a black hole that sucked the meaning out of everything he'd ever known. In a confession, he laid it bare. Life, once a vibrant tapestry, had unraveled into a threadbare rag. I felt that something had broken within me, he wrote, and that what I stood on had given way. This wasn't sadness. It was a bone-deep conviction that nothing mattered, that existence itself might be one big, cosmic shrug. 2. Trapped in a parable. Tolstoy didn't just wrestle with this darkness. He gave it a face, a story. In a confession, he turned to a parable that captured his state of mind perfectly. Picture this. A man's running from a wild beast, heart pounding, legs burning. He stumbles across an old well and, in a panic, leaps inside to escape. But as he falls, he spots a dragon at the bottom, jaws gaping, waiting to swallow him whole. Clinging to a branch growing out of the well's wall, he's stuck, the beast above, the dragon below. That's where Tolstoy saw himself, caught between the terror of existential dread, the beast, and the inevitability of death, the dragon. It was a vivid, gut-punching image of his crisis. No way out, just a fragile grip on survival. 3. The sweetness that kept him going. But here's the twist in that parable, and in Tolstoy's life. While hanging there, dangling between doom and despair, the man notices drops of honey on the branch's leaves. Despite everything, he reaches out, tastes it, and for a fleeting moment, forgets the chaos around him. Tolstoy latched onto this idea hard. Those drops of honey, they were the small joys, a child's laugh, a warm meal, a quiet sunrise, that somehow kept him tethered to life. I saw myself in that man, he wrote, clinging to the sweetness amid the terror. It wasn't a solution, but it was a lifeline, a tiny spark that stopped him from letting go completely. Even in his darkest spiral, something in him refused to surrender. 4. Nihilism's cold embrace. Let's be real, nihilism isn't just a fancy word for feeling down. It's the belief that life has no inherent purpose, no value, no point. For Tolstoy, it hit like a tidal wave. The man who'd once spun epic tales of war and love now couldn't see the worth in any of it. What's the use? He'd ask himself. I'll die, my books will fade, my family will vanish, so why bother? It was like his mind turned into a broken record, stuck on repeat. Nothing matters, nothing lasts. Sleep became his only escape, a way to shut off the noise of those relentless thoughts. He'd lie there, craving oblivion, because waking up meant facing the emptiness again. Nihilism wasn't just a phase. It was a predator, stalking him through every quiet moment. 5. The shadow of suicide. And then came the scariest part, the thought of ending it all. Tolstoy didn't dance around it. He admitted it straight up. I had to trick myself into not taking my own life, he confessed, a raw, haunting line that shows just how close he came. He'd hide ropes, avoid guns, anything to keep that impulse at bay. It wasn't a dramatic cry for attention. It was a quiet, desperate battle with himself. Picture him pacing his estate at night, the weight of the universe pressing down, wondering if the easiest way out was to just stop. The dragon at the bottom of the well wasn't just death. It was a temptation, whispering that letting go might be better than holding on. That he didn't give in says something about his stubborn core, even when everything else was crumbling. 6. A mind at war. What makes Tolstoy's descent into nihilism so gripping is how it turned his greatest strength, his intellect, into his worst enemy. This was a guy who'd spent decades thinking deeply, crafting stories that probed the human soul. Now, that same mind was chewing him up, spitting out questions he couldn't answer. Why live? Why die? Why anything? He called himself an emotional toddler, stuck in a loop of childish whys with no grown-up to explain it. It's almost tragic. The sharper his thoughts, the deeper they cut. Nihilism didn't just challenge his beliefs. It weaponized his own brilliance against him, leaving him raw and reeling. 7. The flicker of resistance. But even at rock bottom, Tolstoy wasn't done fighting. Those drops of honey, that refusal to let the dragon win, they hinted at something tougher in him. Sure, he was drowning in nihilism, teetering on the edge of suicide, but he didn't jump. Why? Because somewhere, buried under all that despair, was a flicker of hope, or at least curiosity. Maybe life was meaningless, maybe death was the end, but what if there was something else? That question, faint as it was, kept him going. It pushed him past the well, past the beast and the dragon, into a search that would define the rest of his days. Nihilism nearly broke him, but it also lit the fuse for what came next, a messy, beautiful quest for meaning. Seeking answers in philosophy and science, Tolstoy's fruitless quest. 1. A mind hungry for meaning. When Leo Tolstoy's existential crisis hit, he didn't just sit there stewing in despair. He went hunting. The questions tearing him apart. Why am I here? What's the point of it all? Demanded answers, and he wasn't about to let them fester unanswered. At 50, with nihilism clawing at his soul, Tolstoy turned to the heavy hitters of human thought. Philosophy and science. This wasn't a casual browse through some books. It was a full-on expedition, a desperate dive into the deepest wells of knowledge. He figured if anyone could shine a light into his darkness, it'd be the great minds of history or the cold logic of science. Spoiler alert. He came up empty-handed, but the journey itself? That's a story worth telling. 2. Philosophy's big names, big letdowns. Tolstoy cracked open the works of the giants, Socrates, Solomon, Buddha, names that carried the weight of centuries. These weren't just thinkers. They were legends who'd wrestled with life's mysteries long before he had. Socrates, with his relentless questioning, seemed like a kindred spirit. Solomon, in Ecclesiastes, mused about the vanity of it all. Buddha offered a path through suffering. Tolstoy pored over their words, hoping for a lifeline, a golden nugget of wisdom to pull him out of the pit. But what did he find? A grim echo of his own fears. Happy is he who has not been born, he concluded from their teachings. Death is better than life. Philosophy didn't lift him up. It dragged him down deeper, suggesting that the only escape from life's absurdity was to never exist at all. For a guy already flirting with suicide, that wasn't exactly a pep talk. 3. The dead end of wisdom. It's not that these philosophers didn't have anything to say. They did plenty. Socrates urged him to question everything, but Tolstoy was already drowning in questions with no answers. Solomon's all is vanity hit too close to home, reinforcing the emptiness he felt. Buddha's detachment from desire sounded noble, but it didn't tell Tolstoy why he should keep going when the dragon of death loomed. In a confession, he wrote that these great minds led me to one simple conclusion. Life is a burden, and one must free oneself from it. That wasn't a solution, it was a surrender. Philosophy, for all its grandeur, turned into a mirror reflecting his nihilism back at him. The more he read, the more he felt like he was chasing shadows, grasping at smoke that slipped through his fingers. For science, a cold, hard look. Frustrated with philosophy's poetic gloom, Tolstoy pivoted to science. Surely the modern age had something concrete to offer. He dug into Darwinism, the hot new theory of the day, with its talk of evolution and survival. Science promised facts, not feelings, a nuts and bolts explanation of existence. But instead of comfort, Tolstoy found a different kind of chill. Darwin's world was one of random chance, where humans were just lumps of energy, as he put it, thrown together by accident. There was no grand design, no cosmic purpose, just cells multiplying until they didn't. We're valuable only when healthy, he mused, and destined for death when our cells grow old. Science stripped away the mystery, but it left him with nothing to hold on to, just a bleak, mechanical universe ticking toward entropy. 5. Darwinism's nihilistic sting. Tolstoy didn't just skim Darwin, he internalized it, and it stung. If humans were just accidental blips in a vast, indifferent cosmos, what was the point of his struggles? His novels, his family, his very breath, all of it reduced to a fluke of biology. In a confession, he called science a dead end for life's big questions. It offers knowledge, but no solace. Darwinism, to him, wasn't progress. It was nihilism in a lab coat, dressed up as truth. Where philosophy at least wrestled with meaning, science didn't even bother to step into the ring. It told him what he was, a blob of matter, but not why he should care. For a man craving purpose, that was like pouring salt on an open wound. 6. The clash of head and heart. Here's where Tolstoy's search got messy. His head loved the rigor of philosophy and science, the logic, the arguments, the data. He was a thinker through and through, a guy who'd built a career on dissecting the human condition. But his heart, That was screaming for something more. Philosophy's death is better mantra felt like a cop-out, a fancy way of saying give up. Science is cold, you're an accident shrug didn't warm the chill in his soul. He wanted a reason to keep going, not a confirmation that there wasn't one. In a way, this clash was his strength. He refused to settle for answers that didn't satisfy both his mind and his spirit. But it also left him stranded, caught between two giants that couldn't deliver. 7. A turning point, not an end. So, philosophy and science failed him big time. But here's the kicker. That failure wasn't the end of Tolstoy's story. It was a pivot. He'd exhausted the ivory towers of thought, stared into their depths, and found them wanting. Neither offered comfort regarding life's purpose or how to live happily. He wrote, and that realization hit hard. But instead of sinking deeper into despair, it pushed him outward. If the great minds and the lab coats couldn't crack the meaning of life, maybe the answer wasn't in books or theories. Maybe it was somewhere else, in people, in faith, in something beyond the reach of reason. This dead end with philosophy and science didn't break Tolstoy. It set him on a new path, one that would eventually lead him out of the dark. For Paths Through the Void, Tolstoy's take on life's absurdity. 1. A lens on human coping. When Leo Tolstoy's existential crisis peaked, he didn't just wallow in his own despair. He turned his sharp, restless mind outward. If he couldn't find meaning for himself, maybe he could figure out how others dealt with the same gnawing void. In a confession, he laid out 4 ways people around him faced the absurdity of life, that sinking feeling that nothing matters in the end. These weren't abstract theories. They were real patterns he saw in his circle, from peasants to aristocrats. Tolstoy didn't just observe, he judged, weighing each path against his own hunger for purpose. Spoiler, none of them fully satisfied him, but they tell us as much about his soul as they do about humanity's. 2. Absurdism, living with a shrug. First up, absurdism. Think Albert Camus here, the idea that life's a mess with no meaning, so you just roll with it. Tolstoy saw people doing this all the time, accepting that existence is a riddle with no solution and saying, so what? They didn't overthink it. They got up, worked, laughed, had a drink with friends, and kept going. Camus would call this defiance, a middle finger to the universe's chaos. Tolstoy got the appeal. It's simple, gritty, even brave in a way. Life's absurd. Big deal, they'd say. I'll just have coffee with my wife and move on. But for Tolstoy, it didn't stick. How do you stay chill when your brain's a buzzsaw, cutting through every illusion? Deaths, losses, personal struggles. They'd crack that, so what armor eventually. He saw it as a flimsy fix, not a lasting peace. 3. Epicureanism, chasing the high. Next, he clocked the pleasure seekers, the Epicureans of his day. These folks drowned out the dread with indulgence. Fancy dinners, new lovers, shiny toys. Tolstoy knew this game. He'd played it in his wild younger years. It's like slapping a band-aid on a broken soul. Feel good now. Forget the fear of death or the nagging why. He saw them piling up wealth, chasing thrills, anything to keep the darkness at bay. But here's where he called BS. It's temporary. That buzz fades, and you're back staring at the same empty hole, only now you're broke or hungover. In his parable of the well, this was the honey on the branch, sweet for a sec, but no match for the beast above or the dragon below. For Tolstoy, living for pleasure was a distraction, not a cure. 4. Suicide, the exit door. Then there's the third group, the ones who couldn't take it anymore. Tolstoy watched people buckle under life's absurdity, deciding the only way out was to end the silly joke, as he put it. This wasn't theoretical for him. He'd been there, ropes hidden, guns avoided, teetering on that edge himself. He saw folks who lacked the strength to keep going but had just enough to check out. It's a brutal choice, and Tolstoy felt its pull, the dragon at the well's bottom, jaws open, promising silence. But he couldn't go there. I couldn't embrace it, he wrote. A quiet rejection that speaks volumes. He'd tell you straight. If you're in that dark place, don't do it. Keep moving, keep searching, answers might come slow, but they come. For him, this wasn't a path. It was a trap. 5. Limbo, the living dead. Finally, Tolstoy spotted a fourth way, what he called a state of existential limbo. This one hit him hardest because it was so passive, so weak. These people saw the futility, the suffering, the death, the lack of purpose, and just stopped. Not suicide, not pleasure, not defiance, just nothing. They didn't reject life or embrace it. They drifted through it, numb and resigned. They recognized the problem but feel too drained to confront it, he observed. It's like they were stuck in quicksand, aware of the mess but too tired to fight. Tolstoy saw this as the saddest state, fully awake to the absurdity, yet spiritually paralyzed. No progress, no hope, just a slow trudge to nowhere. To him, this wasn't living. It was enduring, a ghost life with no pulse. 6. Why none worked for him. So why didn't Tolstoy buy into any of these? Because he wasn't wired to settle. Absurdism demanded ignorance he couldn't fake. His mind wouldn't quit asking why. Epicureanism offered a sugar high, but he craved something deeper than a fleeting buzz. Suicide tempted him, but his stubborn spark wouldn't let him cave. And limbo? That was the weakest of all. He'd rather wrestle the void than float through it half-dead. Each path showed him something about human nature, but none matched his need for a purpose that stuck, something to anchor him when the storms hit. He wasn't just observing. He was testing, sifting through the wreckage of these coping tricks for a truth he could live by. 7. A stepping stone to something more. Here's the kicker. These 4 ways weren't the end of Tolstoy's road. They were signposts. Watching how others handled life's meaninglessness didn't solve his crisis, but it sharpened his focus. If ignoring it, drowning it in pleasure, ending it, or sleepwalking through it didn't cut it, then maybe the answer wasn't in dodging the question. Maybe it was in facing it head-on, somewhere beyond these half measures. This realization didn't fix him overnight, but it nudged him forward, out of the well and into a new search. The beast and the dragon were still there, but Tolstoy was starting to see past them, toward a light he couldn't yet name. Discovering faith through the poor, Tolstoy's turning point. 1. A man lost in his own world. By the time Leo Tolstoy hit his existential rock bottom, he tried everything: philosophy, science, even observing the rich and restless around him. Nothing clicked. At 50, he was a literary titan drowning in doubt, his wealth and fame feeling like chains instead of wings. The questions, why live? What's it all for? Weren't just nagging. They were suffocating. He'd spiraled through nihilism, dodged suicide, and come up empty-handed in his search for meaning. But then, something shifted. Tolstoy started looking beyond his gilded bubble, beyond the intellectuals and aristocrats, to the people he'd barely noticed before, the poor. And what he saw there didn't just surprise him. It shook him to his core. 2. The peasants' unshakable faith. Picture this. Weathered farmers, bent over in muddy fields, hands rough from toil, faces lined with hardship. These weren't the kind of folks Tolstoy rubbed elbows with at fancy dinners. They had next to nothing, no estates, no libraries, no cushy safety nets. Yet, as he watched them, he noticed something astonishing. They weren't crushed by life's weight. Despite the grinding poverty, the endless work, the losses that came with their lot, these peasants carried a quiet strength. And the source? Faith. Not the polished, sermonized faith of the church he'd rejected, but a raw, bone-deep trust in God. Tolstoy saw it in their eyes, heard it in their prayers, a belief that gave them purpose, even when the world gave them nothing else. 3. A stark contrast to his turmoil. This hit Tolstoy like a freight train because it was the opposite of everything he'd been wrestling with. Here he was, a man with everything: money, family, a legacy, and he couldn't find a reason to get out of bed. His mind was a battlefield of doubt and despair, every thought a dagger twisting deeper. Meanwhile, these farmers, with their patched clothes and empty pockets, faced worse hardships than he could imagine: hunger, sickness, death, and still stood tall. How do they do it? He wondered. Their faith wasn't a theory or a debate. It was a lifeline, a rock they clung to when storms hit. Tolstoy, with all his intellect, had no such anchor. The contrast wasn't just striking, it was humbling. For strength in simplicity. What really got to him was how simple it all seemed. These peasants didn't have fancy books or philosophical treatises. Most couldn't even read. They didn't argue about God's existence or dissect Darwin's theories. Their faith was straightforward. God was there, God cared, and that was enough. Tolstoy wrote about this in a confession, marveling at how their belief gave them resilience he couldn't muster. A farmer might lose a crop to frost or a child to fever, yet still kneel in the dirt and pray, not out of habit, but out of conviction. For them, faith wasn't an escape from suffering. It was a way through it. Tolstoy, tangled in his own overthinking, saw this simplicity as a kind of superpower he'd never known. 5. The limits of his own path. This discovery forced Tolstoy to take a hard look at himself. He'd spent years chasing answers in the lofty halls of reason: Socrates, Buddha, Darwin. And what did he have to show for it? A head full of doubts and a heart full of holes. His wealth bought him comfort, but not peace. His intellect gave him questions, but no answers. The peasants, though, didn't need a library or a bank account to find meaning. Their faith wasn't shaken by life's brutality, it was forged in it. Tolstoy realized he'd been running in circles, while these people, with so little, had stumbled onto something he'd missed. It wasn't just their strength that struck him. It was their certainty, a quiet glow he'd lost long ago. 6. A crack in the armor of doubt. Watching the poor didn't instantly flip a switch for Tolstoy. He wasn't ready to trade his skepticism for a hymn book just yet. But it cracked open a door he'd slammed shut decades earlier. He'd ditched religion as a kid, turned off by the church's pomp and hypocrisy after losing his parents. Faith, to him, had always been a fairy tale for the naive. Now, though, he saw it working not in stained-glass cathedrals, but in the muddy fields of Yasnaya Polyana. These peasants weren't deluded. They were surviving, even thriving, in ways he couldn't. Their faith gave them purpose, he reflected. While I floundered in despair, it wasn't proof of God, but it was proof of something, a power he couldn't ignore. 7. The seed of a new journey. This wasn't the end of Tolstoy's search. It was a pivot, a spark that would grow into a flame. The peasant's faith didn't erase his questions, but it reframed them. If reason had failed him and wealth had left him cold, maybe meaning wasn't about thinking harder or having more. Maybe it was about believing in something bigger. He didn't leap straight into their God, but he started to wonder, what if faith, not logic, was the key? What if the infinite could bridge the gap his finite mind couldn't? The poor didn't hand him a tidy answer, but they gave him a glimpse of possibility, a lifeline he'd grab onto, pulling him from the well of nihilism toward a shore he couldn't yet see. Turning to faith, Tolstoy's leap beyond reason. 1. The limits of a brilliant mind. Leo Tolstoy had spent decades leaning on his intellect like it was a trusty compass, guiding him through novels, fame, and life's twists. But by 50, that compass was spinning wild. Philosophy, a dead end. Science, a cold shrug. His existential crisis had chewed up every rational tool he had, leaving him lost in a fog of despair. Why am I here? What's it all for? These questions didn't just haunt him. They mocked him, exposing the cracks in his armor of reason. In a confession, he admitted the hard truth. Life could not be fully understood through reason alone. For a man who'd built his world on thought, that was a gut punch, and the start of a radical shift. If logic couldn't save him, maybe something else could. 2. The infinite over the finite. Tolstoy didn't just give up, he pivoted. After watching the peasants cling to faith like a lifeline, he started to see a pattern. Reason kept him trapped in the finite, the here and now, the dirt and decay of human existence. It was a box and he'd hit every wall. But faith? That was different. It pointed to something bigger, something infinite, a God, a force, a mystery beyond the grasp of his restless mind. I began to recognize that faith in the infinite was the key. He wrote, a realization that felt less like a surrender and more like a breakthrough. The finite world offered suffering and death, The infinite promised purpose, a thread to hold on to when everything else unraveled. For Tolstoy, this wasn't blind hope. It was a lifeline he'd ignored too long. 3. Faith as a bridge. Here's where it gets real. Tolstoy didn't suddenly buy into every church doctrine or start chanting psalms. His faith wasn't about rules or rituals. It was about crossing a chasm. Reason had left him dangling over the abyss, nihilism above, death below, just like that man in his parable clinging to the branch. Faith became the bridge out. It required belief in something greater than the material world, he reflected. A leap his rational side had always scoffed at. But now, battered by despair, he saw it differently. The suffering, the struggles, they were temporary, fleeting shadows in the light of something eternal. Faith didn't erase the pain. It gave it a frame, a reason to keep going when logic said quit. 4. A battle with doubt. Let's not sugarcoat it, this shift wasn't easy. Tolstoy's brain didn't just flip a switch and say, "Cool, God's the answer." He'd spent half a century doubting, tearing apart religion since he was a kid orphaned and let down by the church. That skepticism didn't vanish. It fought back. "My rational mind saw faith as a leap without evidence," he confessed, and part of him still bristled at the idea. But the peasants had planted a seed, their quiet, unshakable trust in God stuck with him. He didn't need proof on a page. He saw it in their lives, in how they faced the same horrors he feared and still stood tall. Faith wasn't about certainty for Tolstoy. It was about courage, a dare to believe when his head screamed no. 5. From despair to peace. And here's the payoff: faith worked. Not overnight, not perfectly, but it pulled Tolstoy out of the pit. The man who'd hidden ropes to dodge suicide, who'd found solace only in sleep, started to breathe again. Faith became a way of enduring life's challenges. He wrote, a shield against the hopelessness that had nearly swallowed him. It didn't answer every why. He wasn't that naive, but it gave him a how. How to live, how to face death, how to find meaning in the mess. That peace wasn't loud or flashy. It was a quiet settling, a calm he hadn't felt since before the crisis hit. Faith didn't solve the puzzle. It made the puzzle bearable. 6. A new lens on life. This wasn't just a personal fix. It changed how Tolstoy saw everything. The infinite wasn't some abstract concept. It was a lens that reframed his world. Suffering, still real but temporary. Death, still coming but not the end. Purpose, not in wealth or words, but in something bigger than himself. Without faith, true happiness was impossible, he concluded, a bold claim from a guy who chased every other path. It's like he'd been staring at a cracked mirror his whole life, and faith handed him a new one. Not perfect, but clear enough to see a way forward. The doubts didn't vanish, but they didn't rule him anymore. Faith gave him ground to stand on when the earth kept shifting. 7. The start of a transformation. Tolstoy's turn to faith wasn't the end of his story. It was a beginning. It didn't tie up every loose end or silence every question, but it set him on a new road. Faith provided life's meaning, a higher purpose beyond human reason. He wrote, and that purpose rewrote his next chapter. He didn't just sit there basking in newfound peace. He acted on it, shedding wealth, embracing simplicity, and pouring himself into helping others. The man who'd once teetered on the edge of oblivion became a beacon, not because he had all the answers, but because he'd found a way to live without them. Faith didn't just save Tolstoy from despair. It launched him into a life he'd never imagined. A life transformed Tolstoy's radical shift. 1. The breaking point of privilege. Leo Tolstoy had spent half a century in a world most could only dream of: sprawling estates, literary fame, a family bustling around him. By 50, though, that world felt like a gilded cage. His existential crisis had stripped the shine off wealth and success, leaving him raw and searching. Faith had pulled him from the brink, showing him meaning in the infinite, but it wasn't enough to just feel it. He had to live it. "I couldn't keep pretending," he wrote in a confession, and that's when everything flipped. Tolstoy didn't tweak his life. He tore it down and built something new, a life of simplicity, service, and unshakable belief. This wasn't a midlife whim, it was a revolution. 2. Shedding the trappings of wealth. Picture this. A man who'd owned vast lands and commanded respect, suddenly giving it all away. Tolstoy didn't just cut back. He walked away from the riches that had defined him. He handed over property, slashed his lavish lifestyle, even started dressing like the peasants he'd once overlooked, rough shirts, simple boots, no frills. His family wasn't thrilled. His wife, Sophia, fought him tooth and nail over it, worried about their kids' future. But Tolstoy was done with the lie of luxury. Wealth no longer brought me peace, he reflected, and he meant it. The man who'd once had everything decided he didn't need it, not when it couldn't fill the hole in his soul. 3. A life of simplicity. Out went the excess, in came the bare bones. Tolstoy didn't just talk about living humbly. He dove in headfirst. He moved to a modest setup on his estate, worked the fields alongside the peasants, and ate what they ate: bread, porridge, nothing fancy. It wasn't a stunt. It was a rebirth. I wanted to live honestly, he wrote, and for him, that meant stripping away the layers of privilege that had insulated him from real life. This wasn't easy. His hands blistered, his back ached, his old habits screamed for comfort. But every step into simplicity felt like a step toward the peace he'd chased for years. He wasn't slumming it, he was finding himself. 4. Helping the poor, a new calling. Tolstoy didn't stop at downsizing. He turned outward, pouring his energy into the people he'd once ignored. The peasants who'd inspired his faith became his mission. He set up schools for their kids, taught them himself, handed out food and clothes, even fought for their rights against a system that crushed them. I saw their strength in faith, he said, and I wanted to give back. This wasn't charity from a distance. He got his hands dirty, listened to their stories, lived among them. The man who'd penned War and Peace now cared more about a farmer's harvest than a critic's praise. Helping the poor wasn't just a duty, it was his purpose, a way to make his faith real. 5. Faith as the bedrock. None of this made sense without faith. It was the heartbeat of Tolstoy's transformation. Without faith, true happiness was impossible, he declared, and he lived that truth. This wasn't the churchy faith he ditched as a kid. It was personal, rooted in a belief in God's infinite presence. Faith wasn't a Sunday ritual. It was the fire that drove him to ditch wealth, embrace hardship, and serve others. It gave me a higher purpose, he wrote, a compass when reason had failed. He didn't need proof or sermons. He felt it in the quiet of a simple life, in the gratitude of a peasant's smile. Faith wasn't an add-on. It was the foundation he rebuilt his world on. 6. A family at odds. Let's not romanticize it. This shift came with a cost. Tolstoy's family didn't sign up for this. Sophia, his wife of decades, watched the man she'd married morph into someone she barely recognized. They'd built a life together, 13 kids, a grand home, and now he was tossing it out like old clothes. She argued, pleaded, even threatened to leave, terrified of losing their security. His kids split between awe and resentment. They didn't appreciate it, Tolstoy admitted, a rare understatement. He wasn't blind to their pain, but he couldn't turn back. Faith had gripped him too tight. This tension wasn't a footnote. It was a storm that shadowed his new path, a reminder that transformation isn't tidy. 7. A legacy of meaning. In the end, Tolstoy's change wasn't just personal, it was a statement. He spent his final years living what he believed. Humble, devoted, tethered to something bigger than himself. I found the peace I'd been seeking, he wrote, and you can feel it in his words. A calm that had eluded him through fame and despair. He didn't solve every riddle or heal every wound, but he didn't need to. Faith gave him a why, to live simply, to lift others, to trust in the infinite. And that was enough. When he died in 1910 at 82, penniless and far from home, it wasn't a tragedy. It was a triumph. Tolstoy didn't just change his life. He redefined it, proving happiness wasn't in having, but in believing. The final chapter, Tolstoy's Peace at Last. 1. A Journey's End. Leo Tolstoy's life was a wild ride, from the heights of literary glory to the depths of existential despair, through doubt, discovery, and a radical remake of everything he'd known. By the time he reached his later years, he'd been through the ringer. Fame, nihilism, a flirt with suicide, and a hard pivot to faith. That long, winding road didn't spit him out broken. It delivered him to a place he'd never expected: peace. At last, I found it, he wrote. A quiet triumph after decades of wrestling. Not in wealth or words, but in a simple faith that carried him to his final days. This wasn't a Hollywood ending. It was real, raw, and hard-earned. 2. A simple faith, not a churchy one. Tolstoy's faith wasn't the kind you'd find in a pew on Sunday. He ditched Orthodox Christianity as a kid, turned off by its pomp and rules, and he never fully went back. Sure, he believed in God, the infinite, the eternal, but his version was his own. It was not entirely orthodox, he admitted, and that's putting it mildly. He didn't bow to priests or icons. He saw faith as a personal bond, a trust in something bigger than the material mess of life. No dogma, no rituals, just a stripped-down belief that God's presence gave meaning to the chaos. It was simple, direct, and for Tolstoy, it was enough to quiet the storm that had raged in him for years. 3. Living what he believed. This faith wasn't just a warm feeling. It shaped his every move. In his 60s and 70s, Tolstoy doubled down on the life he'd started building. Humble, honest, rooted in service. He'd already shed the riches, traded silk for sackcloth, and spent his days with the peasants, teaching, farming, sharing what he had. I lived devotedly, he wrote, and you can see it in the way he carried himself. No trace of the aristocrat he'd once been. His estate, Yasnaya Polyana, wasn't a mansion anymore. It was a hub for the poor, a place where he worked the soil and broke bread with those who'd inspired his turnaround. This wasn't a phase. It was who he'd become, a man living his truth down to the bone. 4. Peace over perfection. Let's be clear, Tolstoy's later years weren't flawless. His family tensions didn't vanish. His wife, Sophia, still bristled at his choices, and some of his kids saw him as a dreamer gone off the rails. He didn't solve every riddle or heal every rift. But that's the beauty of it. He didn't need to. I found satisfaction, he said, not because life got easy, but because faith gave him a lens to see past the cracks. The peace he found wasn't loud or triumphant. It was a steady hum, a calm that settled over him like dusk after a long day. He'd spent so long chasing answers. Now he could live with the questions, trusting they'd sort themselves out in the infinite. 5. The final act. Tolstoy's end came in 1910, at 82, and it was as dramatic as you'd expect from a man who'd lived so fiercely. He didn't die quietly in bed. He left home, fed up with family fights and yearning for one last taste of freedom. He boarded a train, frail but defiant, heading nowhere specific, just away. Pneumonia caught up with him at a tiny station called Astapovo, and there, surrounded by strangers and a few loyal followers, he slipped away on November 20th. I passed away at last, the story could have said, but it wasn't a defeat, it was a release. He died poor, far from the luxury he'd known, but rich in something else, a life he'd made his own. 6. A humble, honest legacy. When you look at Tolstoy's final days, you don't see a fallen giant. You see a man who'd climbed a different mountain. He'd traded fame for humility, wealth for sincerity, and it showed in how he went out. No grand funeral, no marble tomb, just a simple grave back at Yasnaya Polyana, marked by a mound of earth. He lived honestly and devotedly. His own words echo, and that's the truth of it. The guy who'd once dazzled the world with war and peace ended up dazzling it in a quieter way, by proving that peace wasn't in having it all, but in believing in something bigger. His faith, rough-edged and personal, carried him home. 7. Echoes through time. Tolstoy's death wasn't the end. It was a ripple. At 82, he left behind more than books. He left a story of transformation that still hits hard. Faith gave me the peace I'd sought, he'd said, And that's his gift to us, a map through the dark, not with perfect directions, but with a compass pointed toward hope. He didn't tie up every loose end or convert the world to his way. But he didn't have to. His life, humble and foot-worn to the last, whispers a challenge. Maybe meaning isn't in the stuff we chase, but in the trust we dare to hold. Tolstoy found his calm in the chaos, not through orthodoxy's rules, but through a faith as real as the dirt under his nails. So, there you have it, Leo Tolstoy's incredible arc. He started as a skeptic, a man crushed by doubt and despair, staring into the void with no lifeline in sight. But through a long, messy journey, he found something bigger, a faith in the infinite, in a God beyond the reach of reason or riches. It wasn't the neat, polished faith of the church. It was raw, personal, and real. That belief lifted him past the limits of logic and the weight of material things, giving him what he'd craved all along, purpose and peace. From a life teetering on the edge of nothingness, Tolstoy carved out a path of meaning humble, honest, and lit by a quiet calm that carried him to his last breath in 1910. His story isn't just a tale of one man. It's a mirror for us all, a reminder that even in our darkest moments, there's a way forward if we dare to look beyond. Thank you, ZenLight 8 family. And that's a wrap, folks. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into Tolstoy's wild, soul-shaking journey here on ZenLight 8. You guys are the heart of this channel. Your curiosity, your comments, your love for these big questions keep us going. If this story hit you, drop a thought below. What's your take on faith, doubt, or finding peace? Hit that like button if you felt it, and subscribe if you haven't already. We've got more tales like this coming your way. Until next time, keep seeking, keep questioning, and take care of yourselves. This is ZenLight 8, signing off with gratitude. See you in the next one.